It's my belief that the 20th century was a golden age of British painting, unsurpassed before or since. And between the wars, when the character of the nation was under threat, it was our painters who showed us what Englishness was and where it could be found.
I have been asked by the BBC to say something about the English character, and I gladly agreed to do this because I think it is a good thing at a time like the present to take stock, as it were, of our national characteristics, and generally to investigate where it is that we derive what we call our English character and how it is fitted to help us in the struggle that lies before us.
Many started to question what Englishness was and whether it existed at all. But it was Stanley Spencer, one of our greatest painters, who thought he knew the answer. Spencer had grown up in Cookham, a quintessentially English village on the banks of the River Thames. He enjoyed nothing more than the annual regatta, when the entire village came out on show. This was his childhood paradise that insulated him from all the troubles of the outside world. But with the Great War, Stanley's paradise would be shattered. Stanley was torn away from Cookham and endured the horrors of war in Macedonia, which he would commemorate at his Sandham Memorial Chapel. But it was his return home to Cookham that would affect him most deeply. Stanley was pretty much the first man to return to Cookham after the war, but he was greeted with awful news. His younger brother Sidney had been killed on the front over 3 months earlier, and Stanley hadn't even received a letter to tell him of the tragedy. But it wasn't just this. The whole village seemed to have changed. Most of the boys were still away on active service, and where once the sound of laughter and gossip filled these streets, now, like this morning, there was just silence. And I really think that it was at this point that Stanley decided what to do. He would turn Cookham back into the paradise it had been when he was a boy. He began producing a series of inspired religious paintings that transformed the ordinary streets of Cookham into the sites of miraculous biblical events. In Stanley's mind, Christ takes a detour down Cookham High Street on his triumphal return to Jerusalem. The local brewery hosts the Last Supper. And Jesus carries the cross past Stanley's home. But for Stanley, the most uplifting of all biblical stories would take place here at Cookham Churchyard. Stanley envisaged a great spiritual epic, a painting of life and death and life after death, and it was going to be the culmination of his attempt to make Cookham a heaven on earth.
You see, everything has a sort of double meaning for me. There's the ordinary everyday meaning and the imaginary meaning about it all. And I wanted to bring these things together. And in this first big resurrection picture of mine, one has really rather a good example of that kind of thing. I think I'll try and do a sort of personally conducted tour through the picture.
Stanley Spencer's Cookham Resurrection depicts the heroic moment at the end of days when all the dead are reborn into paradise. But as always, Stanley effortlessly combines the epic with the everyday. So it's not Christ who's being resurrected, but Stanley's friends, family and neighbours. And they're not being reborn into a celestial paradise, but Stanley's earthly paradise, his village. You can see God in the porch of the church with Jesus underneath him holding some babies. And along this wall you've got, as you have in the Sistine Chapel, all the prophets and thinkers.
And you notice they're all in different positions of thinking. For instance, that is very much the position of thought.
These figures here, these men, have just come out of the ground. They're a bit dirty, so their wives are dusting down their jackets, as if to say, you know, you're in heaven now, be presentable.
Well, I was thinking of my father and my mother brushing him down before he went to London. Little, intimate, ordinary, personal happenings. Those men lying on the top of the stones I liked very much because it gave me the feeling that the resurrection was a peaceful occasion, and I'm very fond of peace and I like the happiness. That's the main idea of this picture.
And it's all about hope and love and happiness and optimism. You don't get paintings like this anymore. People don't paint pictures like this. Happiness and hope and optimism and love aren't fashionable anymore. But for Stanley, that's what art was all about. And here is Stanley, right in the centre, nude, surveying the scene.
I think that's all I can think about it at the moment.
But it's actually got another dimension to it as well, because there's one character who's depicted not once, not twice, but 3 times in this painting. Here, going over the stile in the distance into the water. Here, smelling a sunflower, and here, wrapped in ivy. And that is a woman by the name of Hilda Carline. And when Stanley first started painting this picture, he'd just met Hilda, and she was to become the love of his life. Stanley had met Hilda at a dinner party and fell in love with her as she was dishing out the soup. And after a protracted courtship, the two married in 1925. At first, they were deliriously happy, and it seemed that Stanley's paradise was complete. But we all know there tends to be trouble in paradise. Stanley had been married for 12 idyllic years when one day there was a new arrival in the village. She was a glamorous young artist by the name of Patricia Preece, and Stanley could not resist her charms. On hearing of his dalliance with Patricia, the village was rife with gossip.
He liked Patricia. She was very elegant then, and I think she led him on. And you know what life is like. Men are very susceptible to the wiles of women, shall we say.
I quite liked her. She was tall and thin, when dressed up very elegant, but if she opened the door, which wasn't often, she used to look terrible.
Well, I think they thought that she was a gold digger and just after him because he was a celebrated artist and making a lot of money at the time. I think he was bowled over by her glamour because Hilda was a member of a very artistic family, unconventional. And I think Patricia was just the opposite. She was very glamorous and I think meant to be rather aristocratic and conventional. And I think he was attracted by that. He was led on by Patricia, who we know was a lesbian living with another woman. So I think in that way he was naive, but perhaps wanted the impossible, you know.
Stanley left Hilda and 4 days later married his lover. And so began a darker period of his life and work. After the marriage, Stanley and his new wife were due to go to Cornwall on honeymoon. But what actually happened was Patricia went ahead early with her girlfriend and Stanley stayed behind with his ex-wife. It was evidently not an ideal situation, and Stanley was so confused and distressed by the situation that he became physically unable to consummate the marriage. And this painting is all about Stanley's impotence. Now, how many artists would make a picture about their own impotence? Picasso only made it about having enormous virility. So you can see this is Stanley confronting this nude woman, and yet it's so extravagantly flaccid, his penis. It's a deeply sexual painting, but I don't think it's at all erotic. There are all these clues everywhere that there's no sex in this marriage whatsoever. The raw meat down here, it's uncooked in the same way that the marriage is uncooked. The fire in the distance is contrasted with the coldness of their flesh. It's a sense of only the fire can artificially warm them up because they themselves are cold. And there's this almost comical fact that Stanley is still wearing his spectacles. But the cast iron proof for me that this relationship is not quite right is contained in the eyes. There's no eye contact at all.